Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Weekend Review for December 8th, 2024. Today, we're talking with Hrant Mikaelian, a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. To our listeners, first of all, we have added over the past few interviews over 1,600 new listeners. So welcome to you all. We really appreciate you subscribing and thank you for listening to us. We hope that we are going to not disappoint.
Indeed.
And also, we really appreciate you commenting on our YouTube videos. So please stay involved. Like our shows, share them with your friends, because that is the kind of thing that will help us gain a little more visibility on the platforms. And of course, we would also love your support. If you are willing to do that, go to podcasts.groong.org/donate and sign up.
And just as a reminder, this is our weekend review show. So we review whatever happened in Armenia last week. And we have different formats. So we also have conversations on Groong and a few other formats. If you care about detailed review of last week's news, then you're in the right place.
And, those are separated by playlists on YouTube. So you can look at our weekend review playlist, or you can look at the Conversations on Groong playlist, and there are some other playlists. Well, for now, hello, Hrant. Welcome to the show. Love to have you on board.
Ողջույն, Hrant.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Okay, well, ils sont tombés sans trop savoir pourquoi. Charles Aznavour's poignant lyrics remind us of the tragedy that united all Armenians after the devastating Spitak earthquake on December 7, 1988. I know that was a seminal event for me also. I remember exactly what I was and what I was doing. And that just kind of woke me up to Hayastan, and my life changed in many ways. So last week marked 36 years since this catastrophe, which claimed tens of thousands of lives and rallied Armenians worldwide, with Aznavour leading global relief efforts through concerts and the Aznavour Foundation. Hovik, what can you say?
The scars of the Spitak earthquake endure. And, I think the government failed to fully utilize diaspora support and goodwill, leaving the earthquake zone still not fully rebuilt. So remembering just this tragedy should inspire us today, urging Armenia's leaders to rally Armenians globally like we did in 1988 and strengthening our nation. Also, if I could reflect, in 1988, I was just a 10-year-old or 11-year-old kid, my first year in America, and I was not very conscious of what was going on in the homeland. And the way I remember this is we were horsing around with other kids in my math class, and my teacher, Vic Hovsepian at Toll Junior High School, scolded us for horsing around while such a tragedy was going on. And that memory has been etched in my brain forever. And I think that indirectly, it also had a bearing on my life, where I eventually, in a few years later, I decided to take a very keen interest in Armenia and eventually moved back. So let's use this week to reflect on how each of us has a role in rebuilding Armenia. And we'd love to hear your comment on how this event changed your life or affected you. Hrant, how about you? What are your thoughts about the earthquake?
Well, to be frank, I was 2 years old when it happened, so I have no personal feeling regarding that. But I can say that many Georgians, I'm from Georgia originally, so many Georgians really tried to help Armenians. They moved to Spitak to help, to Gyumri to help, and it was genuine episode when Georgians were genuinely close to Armenians. Unfortunately, in the last 30 years, the relations were not so friendly, but 1989 united Armenians and Georgians. That's first thing, which is noteworthy. Another thing is that at that time, there was big attention to Armenia, to earthquake zone, but unfortunately, afterwards, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many things happened. There was a war, there was a economic hardship, and there were different struggles for Armenia, and it was, I cannot say it was forgotten, but it was not properly handled. So up until now, we can see that according to the latest poverty survey, Gyumri is the poorest city in Armenia, and Shirak is the poorest region of Armenia, and Lori is also in big trouble. So both regions which were affected by the earthquake both faced great emigration rates after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the earthquake itself. So that's another problem. Another problem is that there was no investigation, and there was a need in investigation because there were several conspiracy theories of different level of credibility. First is that Soviet Union was incorrect in disclosing the number of victims, which is most likely to be true because when I was working with the Soviet Armenian archives, I found out that there were 13,000 missing, which were never reported openly. So basically, most likely they were dead. So in reality, number of people who were dead after the earthquake was 38,000, not 25. That's first thing. Second is that the amount of devastation and the size of earthquake, scale of earthquake, let's say, it was also never investigated in Armenia. There have been several scientific articles by Russian specialists, but nothing else. Then, and one, if I'm not mistaken, one by Japanese. And then the third one is that the earthquake is a result of the nuclear testing or the deliberate underground exposure to punish Armenians. To be frank, I exclude this to be real. There are no grounds for that. But since many people believe in that, and since there was no investigation, it still remains as a trauma and as a question, which I think needs to be addressed. People need to know what ground is for that. And this page, unfortunately, has not been turned. So up until now, you can feel the devastating effect of the Spitak earthquake. So that's what I can say.
Let's move on to the week's news. The latest in the saga of the so-called negotiations. Let's begin with that. Aliyev explicitly said that Armenia must negotiate with the Western Azerbaijan community in order to, and I'm using that in quotes obviously, but he said that Armenians must negotiate in order to ensure, quote, dignified return to their ancestral lands. Even though Aliyev has voiced these demands himself for the first time, it's clear that the Azerbaijani government was preparing for this move a long time. They were preparing for it in the Azerbaijani parliament. They're preparing for it in creating all these various NGOs and lending them credence by hosting meetings under informal circumstances, with even Aliyev himself attending. On the Armenian side, the issue has been largely kept outside of Armenian public attention, although there were various media reports recently that Philip Rieker has been or had been, perhaps in his role as a co-chair, involved in discussions with the Armenian NGO sector on the so-called return of Azerbaijanis to Armenia. We have a link in the show notes if you want to hear that interview on Channel 5. Essentially, the issue on the Armenian side was being handled at the level of NGOs. Let's also not forget recently that Pashinyan, in an interview, brought up the topic of Western Azerbaijan completely out of the blue, and it roused the suspicion of many observers. He drew a parallel essentially between the genuine state sponsored expansionist efforts by Azerbaijan, who spread maps of so called Western Azerbaijan, which for our listeners, for those who are not privy, is Armenia. So he spreads maps of Armenia saying this is Western Azerbaijan. And Pashinyan says, well, they're doing that because Armenians are talking about Western Armenia, our historic homeland. Hrant, is it possible that this issue of so-called Western Azerbaijan or so-called return of Azerbaijani refugees has already been agreed upon or negotiated by Pashinyan with Aliyev and has been deliberately kept away from the minds of the Armenian public? What can you say?
Well, I have heard some leaks from the negotiations, and the discussion on so-called return of Azerbaijanis to Armenia, which has happened since late 2020. I've heard about it at least from 2021. So most definitely it is true. And of course, Pashinyan, drawing parallels between Western Azerbaijan and Western Armenia, is retranslating, broadcasting Azerbaijani narrative, Turkish propaganda, because it's completely fake. First of all, Western Armenia is a historic region, which is known, which has existed historically. Western Azerbaijan is completely fake narrative. That's first. Second, yes, you're right. There have been such discussion. Third, if the Azerbaijanis, which have migrated or have been expelled from modern-day Armenia, have learned that they are from Western Azerbaijan, they would be very surprised, because back then they have been called Yeras or Yerevani Azerbaijanis. So that's how they were called in Azerbaijan, in Armenia, elsewhere in the Soviet times. But the narrative on the Western Azerbaijan is not new. Some people in Armenia say that narrative about Western Azerbaijan, Aliyev has invented after the Second Karabakh War. It is not true. In 1998, the big monograph was published by the Azerbaijani Academy of Science by the direct decree of Heydar Aliyev, father of current dictator of Azerbaijan, which is called Historical Geography of the Western Azerbaijan, which covers every spot of territory of modern-day Armenia, claiming it is Azerbaijani, and represents every settlement in Armenia as Azerbaijani with Turkic toponyms. So this was the policy of Azerbaijan since the end of the Karabakh War, and maybe even before, but at least since the end of the Karabakh War. And I connected to the Turkish involvement, to the involvement of the Republic of Turkey, which definitely has agenda of eliminating of the Armenian statehood, and they view Azerbaijan as a tool for that. So Western Azerbaijan narrative was invented to destroy Armenian statehood. And that is what they are doing. Now, Pashinyan speaking on that, he just participates in that process. Now, regarding the so-called Western Azerbaijani community, first of all, this is a non-existent community. There are no such organizations. This is something which Aliyev has created right now.
And is actively funding it.
Yeah, of course, and promoting on the official level. Like 2 years ago, they have invented a Goicha Zangezur Republic, which covers roughly 40% of the territory of Armenia, which they claim to be Azerbaijani. Now they are talking about Western Azerbaijan. They will throw in some other narratives. By the way, on May 11, 2020, Aliyev has created a so-called expelled Western Azerbaijani government, which for me was definite sign that he's preparing for a war in Karabakh.
Government in exile,
back then. Yeah, government in exile. So for me that was, and now when he speaks that Armenia refuses, so it's kind of an obligation. And Pashinyan is going into this discourse, which means that first of all, they degrade Armenia to the level of the public organization or NGO first, and second, that they are entering the area of completely fake discourse, both Pashinyan and Aliyev, and third, that Aliyev is trying to create a ground for another invasion of Armenia. That's the overall context.
What was surprising to me is that the role of, for instance, U.S. mediators, while of course it still has to be confirmed, but there were reports that Phil Rieker, one of the co-chairs, was actually entertaining this idea. Obviously, it's being cloaked in the lingo of, these are like populations, they have to come back to their homes, without putting any emphasis on the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh was just last year ethnically cleansed, and that should be the priority for Azerbaijan. So without any mention of refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh going first, it's essentially putting an equal sign between Nagorno-Karabakh refugees and all of the former refugees from Azerbaijan that may have lived in Armenia one time, and also putting an equal sign between the genocide that happened in Sumgait and Baku. It was, the way that the Armenians left Azerbaijani territories was horrible. Hundreds of people were killed, whereas Azerbaijanis in Armenia didn't quite experience that fate. It was many have, in fact, received
financial
compensation for their property. So my question is, what do you believe is the level of the U.S. role in this situation? Do you believe that the U.S. is actually trying to foster and bring this issue to the forefront in the Armenian discussions with Armenian civil society groups, just like it's being reported?
I cannot say for sure. What I can say for sure is that Turkey is actively participating, and I think the narrative was invented and created by Turkey. Regarding the US, I cannot say anything because in my contacts with Americans, with American experts or politicians, I've never heard that, but I cannot cover everything, so I cannot deny that as well. But what I can say definitely is that Turkey and Azerbaijan are pushing this officially and are trying to create an excuse for another invasion of Armenia.
Let's move on to the rest of the negotiations. During a meeting of the OSCE foreign ministers in Malta, Secretary of State Blinken proposed Armenia and Azerbaijan continue peace talks with US mediation. But Azerbaijan categorically rejected this offer because Azerbaijan now regards the US, or at least this administration, to be biased and pro-Armenian. We all know that Azerbaijan has been successfully able to play the Russians versus the US and has tactically chosen the venue for negotiations based on its geopolitical interests, and it has done so, as I say, successfully. That's my opinion. I wanted to ask you, is Azerbaijan rejecting US efforts, or is it actually biding its time until Trump administration moves in and it can gain some new favors from the Trump administration in order to switch sides again?
Let me elaborate a little bit on what you have said previously on how Azerbaijan played a US-Russia card. They used it in two dimensions. First, they knew the objectives of both Russia and the West, which were the following. Russia wanted to stay in the region, stay in Karabakh, and US wanted Russia to get out of Karabakh. Basically, neither Russia nor US cared about Karabakh itself. But Russians knew that if Karabakh is ceded completely to Azerbaijan, then they have no foothold, as it happened ultimately. And Americans knew that as well. So at some point, Americans understood that they need to cede Karabakh to Azerbaijan completely, regardless of what will happen with Armenians. That's first thing. Another thing is that both wanted to be the main negotiator. And if they both were involved in the Minsk format for decades, after 2014, it became harder and harder. And after 2022, it became almost impossible. So what did Azerbaijanis do? Or basically Aliyev, who has a rather good diplomatic education compared to Pashinyan especially. So in 2020, when Russians were actively involved, he said, okay, enter Karabakh. If you tell Armenians to cede territories around Nagorno-Karabakh, former autonomous region, then you can enter. That's what they did. And firstly, it were Russians who were negotiating, but then Americans and the European Union wanted to resolve the Karabakh conflict by ceding completely Karabakh territory to Azerbaijan, while the Russians were insisting that they need to postpone the issue until for the future generations where it will be possible to resolve. So to leave Karabakh in the undecided status. And Aliyev started switching towards Brussels and Washington platforms, especially after late 2021 and in 2022, especially after the beginning of Russian-Ukraine war. And Pashinyan has agreed as well, and they switched completely to the Western platform. And by the late 2022, by October, Pashinyan has agreed that Azerbaijani territorial integrity will be a platform. Now, in 2023, they signed an agreement, and in May 2023, with Charles Michel, Aliyev, and Pashinyan signing the agreement. And in September 2023, Aliyev has realized an ethnic cleansing. Russians said if Pashinyan has agreed, we could not do anything. I don't think they are right, but at least the fact is true that Pashinyan has signed ceding Karabakh to Azerbaijan. Immediately after the ethnic cleansing, European Union wanted Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders to come to Granada on October 5, 2023, and signed a new agreement. But Aliyev rejected. When he got everything he wanted from the EU and US, he declared that EU and US are supporting Armenians and started stating some other arguments, which were basically nonsense. But anyway, Aliyev rejected negotiating within Western platform because what West wanted afterwards, to have human rights protected of Armenians, and also they wanted Azerbaijan to get involved into the whole Western thing, which Aliyev had no intention to do. He got what he wanted from the West, and now he is switching back to Russia. He is telling Russians, look, the West is pushing us, and Pashinyan is with the West, and now we are with you. And now Putin buys this argument. And at the same time, Aliyev was going to Brussels and to Washington and telling that, look, Armenia is pro-Russian. And then one day later, he was going to Moscow telling that Armenian is pro-Western. So basically isolating Armenia. Another thing is that Armenian diplomacy did not prevent this isolation from happening. But basically, Armenia was alienated both from Washington and Brussels and from Moscow. And Aliyev got everything he wanted, both from Moscow and from Washington and from Brussels. So now Russians are supporting him, and they are telling that nothing happened, that there was no problem in Karabakh, that it's territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, because now they are supporting, because in their view, this is the way they can keep Azerbaijan close to them. Because after the fact, they have left Azerbaijan, they have left Karabakh, they can do nothing there. So basically, Azerbaijan has used both platforms.
Yeah, so is it continuing to play this game and maybe waiting for some concessions from the Trump administration to maybe go back under US mediation? Or do you see that being a possibility? Because we know that the US State Department is trying hard. In fact, they were in Baku last week as well, I believe, to try to bring Azerbaijanis back to the negotiating table.
Yeah, right. So basically, they don't want any negotiation. They got what they wanted from negotiating tables. They got agreement of Pashinyan. They got territory. They expelled Karabakhi population. And now they don't want any agreement. They don't want peace agreement. So this peace agreement agenda is coming from the West, is coming from Pashinyan, but has never come from Baku. So they don't want it. They are insisting that they have tools of military resolving issues. And Pashinyan wants to avoid that. But when he excludes any kind of military solution, and when he declares that he will sign an agreement, no matter what the price is, he will go to any concession. That means that he's losing any leverage on negotiations, and he never can conclude the negotiation. This is a reality under any negotiating table. Now, Aliyev does not want a negotiated agreement, and when Pashinyan started declaring that there are just 2 articles remaining until the agreement is signed, Aliyev said that until everything is not agreed, nothing has been agreed. By the way, there have been at least 2 cases in the history of Armenian-Azerbaijani negotiations. In 1999 to 2001, the QS negotiations and the Kazan negotiations 2011, beginning from the Madrid Principles of 2007, when the whole document has been agreed, the whole document with no provisions in the beginning. And then in the end, Azerbaijan has rejected both cases. What means that even if the agreement is there, it does not mean that it will be accepted. Azerbaijan can refuse it in the last day. But then there is one more layer, that when you have an agreement, then how you are forcing Azerbaijan to follow it.
Exactly.
There has been an agreement in 2020, which Azerbaijan violated in every point. So what we are dealing with is that there is a country, there is a side, which considers itself a victor, which tries to use every diplomatic solution possible to just gain more, to consolidate its gains or gain more, but they don't want any agreement. They want to win completely. And basically, the ultimate goal is to destroy the Armenian statehood. And this has been declared many times by Azerbaijani officials of different ranks. And there is a public campaign about it in Azerbaijani media and civil society organizations, or gongos, let's say, every day. So I think when we have these intentions, I think we should understand that there is no negotiation. There will be no negotiation. And even if there is, it's a fake negotiation because there is no intention to get an ultimate agreement. The intention is a war. And when we discuss this seriously, will there be a peace agreement or there will be no peace agreement? There will be no sustainable peace. This is completely fake agenda. Yes, mediators want to have it. Yes, Brussels wants it. Yes, Washington wants it. Yes, Moscow wants it as well. They want to be mediators, but there will be no mediated agreement. And no, I don't think they are waiting for Trump, because Trump in first term was, let's say, moderately pro-Turkish, but this term he is not going to be moderately pro-Turkish because there are several people who have been talking about Karabakh issue on very high level, and they're entering the Trump administration. And I think this time it will be a bit different, but it will not affect policy towards Armenia. Let's be realistic. But at least I don't think that Trump is going to be pro-Turkish this time and pro-Azerbaijani moreover.
And if I may, let me add, I mean, it's easy for an outsider who has no deep context into this conflict to come and lecture Armenians that, no matter what the cost, let's just negotiate. And I think that Armenians have shown, in fact, I would say that Armenians generally sort of do want to negotiate. This government has ruined that by completely agreeing to everything. But, no matter what we agree to, Azerbaijan, as you underscored, will not sign any peace deal. And some of the other demands that are being rumored, not even rumored, they're being explicitly told about, is demilitarization of Armenia, the return of the so-called refugees, which essentially means that Azerbaijan will have group of cities or communities in Armenia full of Azeris that it will be able to use as a pretext for future incursions or protecting them, having civil police and so forth. Change of the constitution, essentially deleting significant parts of Armenian national identity so that they can never talk about peace. And I think that will eventually lead to banning of opposition parties, banning of groups that talk about nationalist ideas or that talk about things that are core to our identity. Monte Melkonian, our heroic war in the 1990s. I think all of those Azerbaijan wants to edit away. Jeffrey Sachs was on our podcast last week, and he said that negotiate with your neighbors no matter what. The three major players are Turkey, Iran, and Russia. In this format, try to find something. I think at face value, that is good advice, but how would you negotiate if you were in that place? How would you lead this negotiation in such a way that at least it would be an earnest negotiation and not a capitulation?
Well, first of all, regarding Jeffrey Sachs, I think he knows a lot about US. He definitely knows a lot about Russia, but I don't think he knows a lot about Turkey, Iran, or Armenia. So that's first thing. And yes, generally it's good to have good relations, but you can give good advice to Tutsi about Hutu and so on, but it does not work this way. Next thing is that yes, you are right. They want to create network of communities and obviously to infiltrate Armenia with their special forces and so on and so forth. But basically, it's not even about that. I don't even want to split it into pieces. And yes, they want to export the authoritarianism to Armenia. That's obvious goal as well. But basically, the real intention is to destroy Armenian statehood. We should understand it like that because it's very clear, and it was clearly stated by different ranking officials. How would I behave? There is a challenge. So the challenge is the intended goal of destruction of Armenian statehood. So you need to deter. You need to increase the price for aggression. You need to prepare. you need to create a complex architecture of security of Armenia, and you need to face the challenge. You need to understand what the nature of challenge is, and to recreate the state on basis of this challenge, no matter what it takes. That's what I would do, and that's what is needed to do in Armenia. And negotiating, yes, you can negotiate, but you need to understand that with this Azerbaijan, with this government, with Erdogan, with Turkey, if it did not change its policy, and I don't see it in foreseeable future, with Azerbaijan, which is educating its school children with hate towards Armenians, we are going to have war which will take decades, many, many decades, maybe 5 decades, not less. Anyone who is saying opposite either does not know or is just lying. And if the Azerbaijani generations are educated with extreme hate towards Armenians, that there will be no peace. There will be no peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Again, anyone who is saying opposite either does not know or is just faking, which is Pashinyan doing right now. So we need to face this challenge and to prepare the country for deterring the aggression, because the ultimate goal of Turkey is to go to Central Asia, following the pan-Turkist ideas, which are almost official ideology right now. And Armenia is a country which lies on the road to realization of pan-Turkist plans. That's obvious. It's the same as in the beginning of the 20th century when the genocide was happening. I mean, after Azerbaijan has conducted a massacre in Artsakh a year ago, what was the goal of this massacre? Was it just a coincidence, or maybe it was intended? Of course it was intended. Why people cannot go back? I mean, these are obvious questions, and you can negotiate with no ending, but you need to understand your goal. The goal is not peace. Let's be honest here. The goal is not peace. The goal is survival of Armenia. If we set peace as a goal, and Azerbaijan is setting the victory as a goal, then we are talking about completely different things. We need peace to achieve survival of Armenia or prosperity of Armenia. Then peace is a mean. If peace is a goal, then Armenia is not a goal. Okay? So these are important things to put in the right perspective, which has never been done in Armenia in the last 30 years, unfortunately. That's why we are in this point. And unfortunately, it's not only Pashinyan. It was never done properly in the last 30 years.
Okay, let's move to an international topic right now. Last week, we discussed the terrorist operation against the Syrian government in the north of Syria. It caught Bashar al-Assad's government by surprise, and it looked like it also caught Iranian and Russian intel by surprise as well. Everyone expected that the Syrian army would rebound, kick in, and fight back, but this week, the whole operation ended after Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus fell in the past few days, and Assad and his family have taken refuge in Moscow just over this past weekend. Additionally, it looks like the operation maybe was not an entire surprise for Russia, at least. Possibly there are some rumors that there was an agreed-upon special operation that happened. So, what do you think happened in Syria? Why did it unfold so quickly? And why didn't the Russians or Iranians intervene and support Assad, except in words, I guess? Is it possible that Russia conceded Syria because it's too busy in Ukraine? What do you think happened, Hrant?
Well, regarding Russian policy, I don't think Russians conceded Syria because at least Russians were bombing Syrian jihadists very intensively last month, or even beginning the late October. And during this march through Syria, they have been very active, the air force of Russians. So they have been acting, but, no war can be won in the air. I mean, no ground war can be won in the air. There is one example, of course, the battle for England. But anyway, and so right now, the thing is that the ground force has conceded. Regarding the ground force, Syria stopped fighting almost immediately. What was the reason? We have seen how Syrian soldiers were dropping their guns to the ground and running away. Now, how could that happen? Because they have conceded territories which they have been fighting for a decade or even more. For example, Kuwait Air Base was surrounded by the jihadists, including the ISIS, for several years. They have been completely surrounded, and they have been fighting successfully in the western Aleppo, in Deir ez-Zor, in many places. And now they have conceded those in one day. Okay, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was stronger than ever. Okay, I accept that. Okay, they had low motivation, $30 wage does not add up. Assad regime has rotten, that's obvious. By the way, it was rotten 10 years ago as well. Okay, that is also true. But why did they not concede 10 years ago and they conceded today, like within a day? And by the way, there have been several actions in July, if I'm not mistaken, when some of Syrian army formation have been moved from Aleppo to the desert, to the south, including Tiger forces and some other forces. Al-Quds, by the way, Hezbollah was busy. So I think just like in Iraq war, in US-Iraq war in 2003, Syrian generals have betrayed Syria for money. And I think that's what has happened.
So you think they were paid off?
Yeah, and not only paid off, because several were killed. So those who did not cooperate, they have been killed. So I think it's part of the big game where Russia and Iran are obvious losers, and Turkey and Israel are obvious winners, and US is just keeping the status quo for themselves, which is also not bad for them. So that's what I think what has happened. But what I also think is that we need more time, more information, and I think we will know more to get the full picture. But from what I get now, this is a reality.
Well, we're obviously very concerned about the Syrian Armenian community, the Armenians of Aleppo, Kesab, and I hope we will collectively find ways to assure their safety. This overall operation seems to have been planned and tactically guided by Turkey and assisted by US and Israeli intelligence and guidance. In a sense, I cannot but see the parallels between this and the 44-day war. After the fall of Damascus, Israel is now essentially directly on the Iraqi border, which is basically a very porous line on the sand. So it's much closer to Iran, and of course, Israel is also on Azerbaijan's southern border with Iran. What does this situation in Syria mean for Iran then? And for Armenia, what does it portend about Iran's ability to deter Azerbaijan in case it invades Armenia to realize its so-called Zangezur corridor?
By the way, one more interesting fact. Ukrainian instructors have been training Hayat Tahrir al-Sham for several months, especially of working with drones before this operation. So obviously this could not take place without US, UK, and Turkish active involvement. So that's just overall context. Now regarding the consequences, I think this means, and by the way, Iranians right now reject it, but I think this means that Iran's so-called axis of resistance is collapsing completely, because what has left of this axis of resistance, Hezbollah is collapsing, and especially after Syrian collapse, I don't think Iran will be able to supply Hezbollah. Syria has collapsed, and what Iran is left with is Houthis in Yemen. But right now, these days, Americans are being deployed on the border with Yemen from Saudi side, and Israel is preparing for the operation against Houthis. So I think within months, we will see operation against Houthis, which will aim to destroy their military potential. So I think this will effectively mean that Iran's imperial project of the Middle East has collapsed. And I think Syria, which was one of the crucial elements of it, has shown that it is almost inevitable. Moreover, we have seen reports that Iran is very quickly increasing the reserves of rich uranium, which means they are either preparing to create nuclear bombs or they have already created. I would say that most likely they have already created nuclear bombs. So what means that Iran is preparing for self-defense. So I think this also is very worrying in terms of Armenian survival, because yes, there have been some reports in Turkish media and by Turkish politicians that so-called Zangezur corridor is the next. And obviously, since they gained a landslide victory in Syria, wherever they aim, they will be more and more assertive too. That is obvious. You don't need any citations for that. And since one of the main declared goals is the so-called Zangezur corridor, it is obvious that they will push there. And Zangezur corridor is not a Mehri corridor, which has been discussed 25 years ago. Zangezur corridor, according to Turkish maps, is the whole Syunik and Bayazor region. What they want is to take the whole south of Armenia, be able to directly connect to Azerbaijan, and to go to Caspian, and next to the Central Asia. That's what is Turkish aim. And since we're not preparing for deterrence, for hard deterrence, I think we're in a big trouble, under the big risk. I don't know when, but frankly speaking, the issue of Turkey and Azerbaijan jointly attacking Armenia, aiming to claim the whole south of Armenia, is switching from if to the when question.
Indeed, I mean, I think that we can see the writing on the wall, and one questions what the Armenian authorities are thinking about right now. But let's move on because of our time, Hrant. The post-election unrest in Tbilisi in Georgia continues. President Salome Zurabishvili continues to lead the civil society types funded by the West to demand an annulment of the election results, which gave Georgian Dream a parliamentary majority. And there's a date, December 14, when there will be a vote on the president of Georgia. What are your thoughts about what's going on in Tbilisi since you're Georgian? It's very interesting. One thing I noticed is for the last 3 years after the capitulation by Pashinyan, Armenian, I would say truly grassroots efforts, protests against Pashinyan have been widely ignored essentially by the West, even though there were days when during the protests, during the, for instance, resistance movement, in one day, at least like 500 people were arrested in one day. Not a single peep from Western observers, calling both sides to refrain from using, going through extreme measures. Meanwhile, in Georgia, we see people using fireworks like flamethrowers. We're seeing people shining lasers at the eyes of the police. And the West is claiming that these are peaceful protesters. I mean, and the government only arrested like 40 people or something. But the West is saying, the government is using extreme force against peaceful protesters. And of course, they're not recognizing the results of the election. So, what do you have to say about the comparison between these two developments?
This is very legitimate comparison because the countries are neighboring, share very similar background. Now, you said the West has not made any statement about the protests in Armenia. No, they did. They supported government. They supported government's violence against opposition. They declared that at least it's better than on March 1st, 2008. That's what explicitly has been said by the Western politicians. Also, there have been reports in the media that, or some articles, analytical papers, that they were stating that Armenian protest is bad and Georgian protest is good, yet several years ago. Now, this time, US Embassy has urged protesters to stay in line with law and blaming protesters for violation of law, not the government. So I disagree. US did notice and did support the government and was strictly against the opposition and against any movement against Pashinyan. So that's first side. Now regarding the opposition movement in Georgia. In Georgia, obviously protest is not peaceful. The protest is violating the law, obviously, and the protesters are throwing Molotov cocktails or fireworks against the police. They are beating, attacking, and so on. And they are marked as peaceful protesters. Now, if we look at the technology of this protest and try to compare it to the Ukrainian Maidan, we would not be able to find even one small difference. And by the way, the level of involvement of Western politicians in Georgian events is extensive. The ministers of European countries are coming and participating in the rallies against the government in Georgia, which is violation of any diplomatic protocol you can imagine. So this is a reality, but they think that since they represent the big community of countries, rich and important, that they can do whatever they want to achieve their goal. It's not about law, it's only about politics, and it's direct political attack on Georgia. That's what I can make of it, because Georgian people has elected this government. Like it or not, there is no proof, literally no proof that elections are fake. Elections were transparent, true, and the government has won. So now they want to punish Georgian people and they want to overthrow the government from the outside of the country to install a puppet government which will drag the country into the war. That's the reality. Basically, when they are speaking of radical opposition here and there, then they are speaking of moderate opposition like Syrian jihadists. So I think it's not good time to listen what CNN says today. I think what they are saying, speaking about Georgia, is a complete nonsense. I think it will become a big issue for the politicians which are involved into it. And by the way, Trump administration, through the future ambassador to the US, has already declared support to the Georgian government. So I think it will not be an easy walk for the European Union and for the current American administration, who are really trying to overthrow the democratically elected Georgian government. And that's what is the reality. And creating new Syria in Georgia, I think it might be a trouble for them, because there is no crack in Georgian government compared to Ukrainian government 10 years ago. So I don't think it will play out the same way.
Hrant, let me bring us back to Yerevan. In November, Pashinyan text-fired a number of his friends and colleagues from their government positions. Some were glaringly inappropriate. For example, Karen Andreasyan, as the head of the Supreme Judicial Council, SJC, should at least theoretically have been independent of the executive branch and immune from demands to resign. But Andreasyan's subservient resignation proved that there are no checks and balances in the various branches of the Armenian government, be it executive, legislative, or judicial. On the legislative side, Member of Parliament Hovik Manucharyan was the only recipient of the text who refused to comply. Okay, Manucharyan is no angel, and Pashinyan seems to have plenty of compromat on him, and reportedly he was immediately summoned to the Anti-Corruption Committee, the ACC. His mobile devices were confiscated for investigation, and surprise, the data was shared with Pashinyan, who then shared it with the ruling party leadership. Manucharyan is now allegedly being blackmailed for his refusal to resign. So, what do you think? Are we seeing cracks appear in the ranks of the civil contract ruling party, Hrant?
Well, we see a minor crack there. Of course, there have been reports that many MPs now are deleting their own chats and so on. But what I think is that it's not only that Pashinyan has compromised on Hovik Manucharyan, but this time Hovik Manucharyan has compromised on Pashinyan. That's what they are afraid of. That's first thing. Regarding the officials, it is important that all of those, by the way, including the anti-corruption card as well, have been used. Generally, they represent the Ministry of Interior and Judiciary system. They represent the agencies through which Pashinyan is projecting his power internally, either realizing repressions, for example, against Kocharian and his supporters, or creating conspiracies like one which 2 months ago allegedly Russia wanted using 6 people to overthrow the government and so on. So basically, he utilizes these agencies to project his power locally. And the thing is that these people who are in charge of these institutions have become rather powerful, especially Argishti Karaman, who has felt that he is becoming a very important person in Armenia. He is deciding who is what and so on. So Argishti Karaman was perceived as a threat by Pashinyan and all of the other politicians as well. And I think, given that the turbulence is existing in the overall context of Armenia and Pashinyan himself, he is afraid that after the government change in the United States, after the policy change in Georgia, after the end of Russian-Ukraine war, which will most likely happen in 2025, I think there are more talks about peace negotiations than about war right now. And after some other major changes, his government might be challenged. And the overall context which created his government is changing right now. So he is trying to eliminate any of officials who can be used to overthrow him or who can replace him. So this is what this game is about, and it's connected to the foreign politics, but his coming to power was also connected to the foreign politics. So right now he is very afraid of these international changes. That's why he is trying to be assertive in Armenia. And by the way, he is pushing towards local government as well. For example, they are trying to jail mayor of Kapan, mayor of Gyumri, and of Parakar. They are trying to put their own party representatives in these communities, and those are important communities. So he's
They
trying
seem to be having a lot of problems in Gyumri.
Right, in Kapan as well. What I want to say is that losing the popularity and being unable to win local elections, they are trying to use the police force to do that.
Mhm.
And basically, they understand that they are not capable of winning elections. And I think any poll data is not giving us the full picture, because if we look at the Yerevan elections, which took place in September 2023, when the ruling party got just 32% with very, very extremely low turnout, this shows that basically this government has no support. It does not mean that any other party has support or more support than this government. No, but at least we can say that this government knows that they don't have support, and they are trying to consolidate the power within their party group. Because what we see in Georgia, for example, is that if the government is consolidated, then it's very difficult to overthrow this government. But if the government has cracked, then it's very easy to overthrow this type of government, like Syrian government. So what I want to say is that Pashinyan is afraid of losing power in 2025 or 2026. And by the way, there have been many talks about early elections, which he wanted to have in 2025. But all these talks have stopped right now because after seeing how people vote in US, in Georgia, in Moldova, in other countries, I think he is afraid that he might get unexpected outcome, and he decided to bet on the 2026 elections.
All right, let's wrap up our topics here. I'd like to ask each of you if there's been something on your mind from the past week. Well, I say usually the past week, but really what I mean is from the last time that you are actually on our show, Hrant. Something that you would like to share with our audience. What's on your mind?
Well, last 2 weeks I've been following Syrian events very, very strictly, and it remembered how I was following Syrian civil war since 2014, day by day. And, I think Syrian case is very important, both for Armenia, both regionally and globally as well, because this is a case of total state collapse. It was partial collapse within the civil war since 2011, and now it is a total state collapse. Some believe that now, okay, there will be a radical government, there will be a jihadist government, but there will be still some government. There will be no government. In my view, it will be very hard to consolidate the power, and I think this will be a very important case, which we'll still need to follow. And of course, we need to follow the fate of Syrian Armenians, but overall Syrian case, I think it's the most important thing right now.
Hovik, what's on your mind?
On the same topic, people are sharing in their social media these pictures where Erdogan, his wife, and Bashar al-Assad and his wife are sitting smiling. That was the honeymoon period when Erdogan was trying to court Bashar al-Assad. And there is this passage in Samuel Varmanyan's book, Alone Against Fate, Միայնակ ընդդեմ ճակատագրի. It's in Armenian. It details a period when, in 2009, Bashar al-Assad, I believe, visited Armenia, or the two of them met, and Assad was talking about friendship with Turkey and with Erdogan. And Serge Sarkisyan is quoted in that book, which is published in 2023, by the way, as saying that my friend, Serge Sarkisyan told Bashar al-Assad, my friend, you don't know the Turks well, and time will tell. And unfortunately, Serge Sarkisyan proved to be right. And we have what we have today. And unfortunately, I also have to underscore all these pundits, even conservative pundits, even people who are pro-Russian or were pro-Russian, who were trying to justify Erdogan all this time and are now like angry or upset that Turkey would do such a backstabbing move and help Israel and invade Syria. Whereas, Armenians knew this all the time. Even Iranians. So even some Iranian propagandists were trying to be very careful towards Turkey. But Erdogan basically fooled all of them. Unfortunately, not the Armenians that I think are followers of this show, or at least we've been trying to warn everyone. But yeah, I think that is a litmus test when you see these people now feigning or showing anger at Erdogan all of a sudden, where they were praising Erdogan 2 weeks ago. That can be a measurement of their caliber of expertise, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you for your thoughts. Let's leave it there for today. Thank you, Hrant, for joining us.
Thank you, Hrant.
Thank you.
That was our Week in Review show recorded on December 9, 2024. We've been talking with Hrant Mikaelian, who is a political scientist and economist in Yerevan. He represents the Armenian Research Institute. For more information on the participants in this episode, check out our show notes at podcasts.groong.org/episode number. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.